Hello, my dear friends. It's Chris. Welcome back to an evening of timeless tales and enduring magic. Tonight, we're stepping into a story that has echoed through human consciousness for generations, one that speaks to transformation, resilience, and the quiet power of maintaining one's integrity in the face of cruelty. We're settling in with an original retelling of Cinderella. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Cinderella, another version of that old fairy tale? And yes, perhaps. But here's what fascinates me. The very fact that we keep returning to this narrative tells us something profound. A story doesn't endure across centuries and cultures unless it speaks to something true about the human experience. And Cinderella does exactly that. What draws me to this story is what makes it so deceptively simple on the surface. On one level, it's about a girl in rags who transcends her circumstances. But beneath that glittering surface lies something much deeper. It's about the quiet dignity of those who suffer injustice without becoming hardened by it. It's about the radical act of remaining kind when the world has given you every reason not to be. It's about recognizing that your worth isn't determined by circumstance, that your value doesn't depend on what others think of you, and that sometimes transformation comes not from changing who you are fundamentally, but from the world finally seeing what was always there. For mature listeners like yourselves, there's real substance here. Psychological depth, social commentary, and a meditation on how we choose to move through a cruel world. This is a story about patience that isn't weakness, about hope that isn't naivete, and about the kinds of magic that exist in kindness, generosity, and an unshakable belief in goodness. Imagine, if you will, a grand house on a quiet street. Imagine the contrast between the glittering public spaces and the dim kitchen where ashes gather in the hearth. Imagine the sound of a young woman's voice humming softly as she works, unbroken by her circumstances. Imagine a night when the whole world seems possible, when magic feels real, when transformation becomes tangible and destiny speaks in languages we can finally understand. Let us enter that world now, where enchantment waits just beyond the veil of ordinary life.
In a prosperous town stood a grand house of stone and timber, its windows gleaming with candlelight in the evenings. Within this house lived a gentleman of considerable means, a widower with one daughter from his first marriage. The girl's name was Ella, and she possessed a quality that seemed to draw light to her, a gentle spirit, an unfailing courtesy, and a capacity for kindness that appeared boundless. But the gentleman, lonely in his widowhood, married again. His new wife arrived with two daughters of her own, young women of considerable physical beauty, yet marked by a peculiar coldness of spirit. Where Ella's eyes held warmth, theirs held calculation. Where Ella moved with grace born of genuine consideration for others, they moved with the sharp precision of those accustomed to always getting their way. Within months of the marriage, the gentleman fell gravely ill. He lingered through the seasons, growing weaker, until at last he passed from this world. And with his death came a revelation that shocked no one who knew the stepmother's true nature. She was merciless. The will was read, the estate was managed, and once the formalities were concluded, the stepmother's mask fell away entirely. She had married for security and status, not love. Now that she had achieved both, she felt no obligation to maintain even the pretense of affection toward her stepdaughter. Ella found herself transformed overnight. The comfortable room that had been hers became the property of a visiting cousin who never came. Her fine clothes were redistributed among her stepsisters. Her place at the family table was quietly eliminated. By degrees so subtle that outsiders saw only gradual decline, she became less a daughter of the household and more a servant within it. She was given work, endless work. The kitchen became her domain, though not as a valued place of skill and artistry, but as a location of drudgery. She rose before dawn to light the fires, prepared meals that she herself would not eat, scrubbed pots until her hands grew raw. The servants, following their mistress's lead, treated her with casual indifference. Some, sensing opportunity, treated her with outright contempt. Yet Ella did not become bitter. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her story, not that she suffered, but that suffering did not corrupt her. She completed her tasks without complaint. When her stepsisters made demands, she met them with courtesy. When they mocked her, she did not respond with anger. This was not weakness, you understand. It was something far more difficult to achieve, a conscious choice made daily to preserve the integrity of her own spirit regardless of how others treated her. The servants began to call her Cinderella, a name born from the cinders and ashes that constantly marked her clothing and skin. But she wore the name with no shame, simply as an acknowledgement of her current station.
Years passed in this manner. Ella was no longer a young girl when everything changed. She was a young woman now, and her beauty, which had never depended on fine clothes or jewels, had only deepened. But because she was always seen in the kitchen, always covered in the marks of labor, few in the town remembered that she had once been promised a different life. Then came the announcement that shattered the ordinary rhythm of the household. The crown had issued a proclamation. The young prince, who had come of age and must soon take the throne, would host a grand ball. Every unmarried woman of marriageable age in the kingdom was invited to attend. It was understood, though not explicitly stated, that the prince would be selecting a bride. The stepmother heard this news and saw in it the answer to her deepest aspirations. Her daughters were beautiful, or so she believed. They were clever enough in the ways of manipulation and social climbing. Surely one of them could catch the prince's eye. Surely one of them could become queen. She threw herself into preparations with an intensity that bordered on frantic. Seamstresses were summoned, jewelers were consulted, fabrics arrived from distant cities, silks and satins, laces and brocades. The stepmother supervised every detail, her voice sharp with the anxiety of ambition. And Ella? Ella found her labor increased. Her hands were never still. She altered hems, arranged feathers, polished jewelry until the candlelight danced across its surfaces. She listened to her stepsisters argue endlessly about which dress was more flattering, which jewels more impressive. She offered suggestions when asked, compliments when appropriate, all with genuine graciousness. One evening, as the final preparations were underway, her older stepsister turned to her almost as an afterthought and asked, "Cinderella, why do you not dress yourself in finery? Will you not attend the ball?" It was meant as a jest, a cruel one. The other stepsister laughed, anticipating the humiliation of watching Ella acknowledge the impossibility of her situation. But Ella simply smiled, a smile that contained no trace of bitterness, only a kind of gentle acceptance. "I would have no dress suitable for such an occasion, and besides, someone must remain here to ensure the house is properly maintained in your absence." "How practical," the stepmother observed dryly, and the matter was dismissed.
On the evening of the ball, Ella stood in the doorway, watching her stepmother and stepsisters depart in a carriage, their faces alight with anticipation and competitive fervor. The house settled into silence around her. She had returned to the kitchen to complete her tasks when she became aware that she was no longer alone. The woman who stood in the shadows of the kitchen was neither young nor old, neither servant nor master. She wore robes of deep indigo, and her presence seemed to make the air around her shimmer with possibility. "You wish to attend the ball," the woman said. It was not a question. Ella looked up, unsure whether this was dream or reality. "It would be lovely," Ella replied carefully, "but I lack the means." What if, the woman said, stepping forward, and her eyes now seemed to contain depths of kindness accumulated over centuries. Means were no longer an obstacle. In that moment, Ella understood. This woman was something beyond the ordinary, not merely present in the world, but perhaps more truly present than anyone Ella had ever encountered. She was, for lack of a better word, magic itself made manifest. "I am what some call a guide," the woman explained. "I appear at moments when a soul has demonstrated that it deserves the chance to see beyond its current circumstances. You have suffered injustice without becoming injurious. You have been diminished without diminishing yourself. This is rare. This is worthy of assistance."
What followed unfolded with a logic that was its own kind of mathematics, one where imagination and will intersected with reality and rearranged it. The woman pointed to a pumpkin resting in the corner, awaiting preparation for the kitchen. "This will serve," she said, and as she gestured, the pumpkin began to transform, its form expanding, its surface becoming smooth and polished, until a magnificent carriage stood where the vegetable had been, adorned with silver filigree. Mice scurried about in their traps. With a wave of the woman's hand, they became horses, spirited and noble, their coats gleaming. A rat emerged from behind a cupboard and became a coachman, resplendent in livery that had never been tailored by any hand. But the most remarkable transformation was reserved for Ella herself. The woman approached her and for a moment simply looked at her, truly looked at her, as though seeing not just who she was, but who she had always been beneath the ashes and labor. Then she raised her hands, and Ella felt change ripple through her. Her worn kitchen dress became a gown of such beauty that the candlelight seemed insufficient to properly illuminate it. The fabric itself seemed alive with color, shifting between pearl and silver, moonlight and starlight. Upon her feet appeared slippers fashioned from crystal so clear and delicate that they seemed barely tangible, as though spun from frozen tears and hardened starlight. Ella gazed at herself, scarcely believing the reflection before her, but the woman caught her attention with a gentle touch. "Listen carefully," she said, "for this magic, like all things bound to the natural world, operates within limits. You must leave the ball before midnight. When the clock strikes 12, this carriage will become a pumpkin once more. Your horses will become mice. Your gown will become rags. These slippers alone will remain unchanged, a reminder that some transformations are permanent even when the magic fades." "Why midnight?" asked Ella. "Because that is when the spell that holds the world in a particular configuration releases. That is when illusion and reality must renegotiate their boundaries. If you remain past that hour still wearing the magic, you will be trapped between what you were and what you appeared to be. You will belong to neither world." Ella understood. "I will leave before midnight," she promised. The carriage ride through the moonlit streets felt like traveling through a dream. The town transformed as she passed through it, becoming something grander, more significant.
The palace loomed before her, its windows ablaze with light, music pouring forth into the night. As she descended from the carriage, the assembled guests, servants, and nobility alike turned to stare. Who was this vision of beauty? No one recognized her. Her face was Ella's face, yet transformed by something that had nothing to do with cosmetics or artifice. It was as though for this one night everyone could see what those closest to her had somehow managed to miss, that beneath the ashes was someone remarkable. Even her stepmother and stepsisters failed to recognize her, though they sensed something in her presence that troubled them without understanding why. The prince, standing near the great staircase, turned toward the sound of the crowd's murmuring. When his eyes fell on Ella, his expression transformed. Here, at last, was someone who moved with genuine grace. Here was someone whose beauty emerged from something deeper than surface perfection. He descended the stairs and extended his hand to her and asked, "May I have the honor of this dance?" And Ella, remembering everything that the woman had told her, remembering the limits and the boundaries, allowed herself one night of dancing, of being seen, of existing in the world as she had always deserved to exist. She and the prince danced dance after dance, and as they moved together, they spoke about books and philosophy, about dreams and disappointments, about the nature of character and the meaning of kindness. The prince found himself captivated not merely by her beauty, but by her mind. Here was someone who understood him, who challenged him gently, who saw him not as a crown or a throne, but as a person. The evening progressed. Midnight approached. Ella felt the shift beginning, a subtle loosening of the magic, like threads starting to unravel. "I must leave," she said urgently. "But why?" the prince asked, confused. "The evening has barely begun." "I cannot explain," she replied, and she pulled away from him, gathering her skirts. "But I must go, now." She ran toward the great doors as the first chime of midnight began to sound. The prince, startled and bewildered, followed her. As she descended the palace steps, her gown began its transformation back to rags. But in her haste, one of the crystal slippers slipped from her foot and fell upon the marble steps. She did not stop to retrieve it. She could not. The carriage was already changing, its magnificence collapsing into the simple form of a pumpkin. She climbed inside as it transformed, and the mice horses carried her swiftly through the streets. When the carriage came to rest near her home, it was simply a pumpkin once more. Ella stepped out, her fine gown reduced to tatters, her feet bare except for the single crystal slipper that remained. She made her way to the kitchen unobserved and was back at her work when her stepmother and stepsisters returned home, still bubbling with excitement and frustration.
They had seen the mysterious woman, they reported. They had competed for the prince's attention, but he had seemed utterly uninterested in them, fixated instead upon some vision of beauty they could not identify. It was infuriating. Ella listened to their complaints, and when asked, offered them cool water and sympathetic words, as though their disappointment truly mattered to her. The next morning, news spread through the kingdom. The prince was searching for the mysterious woman from the ball. He had only one clue, a single crystal slipper. He would visit every household in the kingdom until he found its match. When the prince arrived at Ella's home, the stepmother saw an opportunity. Her daughters rushed to try on the slipper, pushing and squeezing their feet, arguing about whose shape it might fit. But crystal, it seemed, could not be forced or manipulated. The slipper remained unchanged. "Is there anyone else in this household?" the prince asked, observing the obvious failure. The stepmother's eyes flashed with something cold and dismissive. Only the kitchen girl. She was not at the ball. But Ella, hearing the prince's voice, emerged from the kitchen. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in that moment,
recognition passed between them, not based on gowns or magic, but on something more fundamental. He had danced with her spirit. He recognized it now in her eyes. "May I?" he asked, extending the slipper. She accepted it and slipped it onto her foot. It fit perfectly. And as it did, the other slipper appeared upon her other foot, the magic releasing its final gift, acknowledging that this was indeed the woman from the ball. The stepmother's face went rigid with shock. Her daughters began to protest, to insist that some trick had been played, but the prince was already offering Ella his hand. "I do not yet know your name. Or rather, I know you are called Cinderella, but I sense there is more to learn about who you truly are. Will you come with me so that we might discover that together?" Ella looked at him, at this person who had seen her, truly seen her, beneath all the trappings and circumstances. She looked back at her stepmother and stepsisters one final time, and in her expression was neither triumph nor bitterness. There was only a kind of gentle release, as though she had been holding something and was finally allowing it to go. "I will," she said. As she left the house, she did not look back. She walked forward into a future that she had earned, not through magic, but through the integrity she had maintained when no one was watching. The prince at her side was merely the external manifestation of a reward that had already been written into her character. She had chosen to remain herself despite every pressure to become something lesser, and the world had finally caught up to that truth. In the years that followed, Ella became known not as a princess who had been rescued, but as one who had rescued herself, simply by refusing to let circumstances determine her worth. The kingdom spoke of her wisdom, her kindness, and her uncanny ability to see the good in people others had dismissed. And in the palace library there was said to be a crystal slipper, preserved under glass, a reminder that sometimes the smallest, most fragile things can be the most unbreakable. And so we leave Ella, or Cinderella as some still call her, having learned what perhaps the oldest versions of this story have always known, that transformation is not something that happens to us. It is something we become through the choices we make, again and again, in quiet moments when no one is watching and everything is asking us to change who we are at our core. Thank you for joining me this evening. If you've enjoyed this journey, I invite you to return for more tales of transformation and magic. Until then, may you find your own moments of grace.